From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about Turkey. The local elections held at the end of March resulted in a significant setback for the longtime ruling Justice and Development Party, which lost control of Istanbul, Ankara, and several other major cities to the opposition Republican People's Party. On the international front, relations with the U.S. are also at a low point, and the long-running dispute over Turkey's proposed acquisition of the Russian S-400 missile defense system is a major point of contention. This week brought a further complication in the form of an announcement by the U.S. that it would not extend sanctions waivers for Iranian oil, on which Turkey relies, past early May. In all, it's a tricky time for Turkey, and to discuss where things stand, I'm joined today by Bob Pearson, a non-resident scholar here at MEI, former U.S. ambassador to Turkey, and former Director General of the U.S. Foreign Service, and Sinan Ulgen, a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe in Brussels, founding partner of consultancy Istanbul Economics, and chairman of the independent Istanbul think tank, the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies. Bob and Sinan, thank you both for joining the program today.
Happy to be here.
Glad to be there as well.
Sinan, I'd like to start with you. Since the last time that we covered Turkey on the podcast, the country has held local elections, and the results were, as I alluded to in my intro, surprising. Can you give us a kind of brief recap of what happened?
Sure. I mean, it was surprising in the sense that the ruling AK Party lost a majority of Turkey's metropolitan cities. So what happened is firstly symbolic, because the opposition now is in control of the capital Ankara, but also Istanbul, which is Turkey's economic heartland. And this is happening after 25 years. The political family of AK Party had won the elections in Istanbul and Ankara back in 1994, and since then had held on to these cities. So that's both symbolic but also structurally important, because now after these elections, 60 cities that represent almost 65% of GDP are now being controlled by the opposition. The reason why we've ended up with this outcome is essentially because of a combination of three factors. One, the economic backdrop. Turkey has had elections against a technical recession for the first time in a decade, and that has certainly given rise to a political reaction. Secondly, the traditionally belittled opposition this time around did particularly well in terms of its own organization, in terms of the effectiveness of the coalition, the alliance that's set up, but also in terms of being able to monitor the ballots on the day of the election. And the third important factor to highlight here has been the candidates themselves, in particular in Ankara and Istanbul, where the opposition was able to field candidates, İmamoğlu in Istanbul and Mansur Yavaş in Ankara, that were able to go above and beyond the core constituency of the opposition and draw some support, at least, from the more conservative AK Party voters.
Bob, in your view, who are the big winners from this election?
Well, the Turkish people were the big winners because they turned out at 85%, which ought to make every American ashamed, given our own system. And they showed that they haven't given up on democracy, and they haven't given up on the kind of rule of law republic that they were originally dedicated to. I think the CHP, the Republicans' People's Party, really obviously the first big winner because of the wins in Ankara and in Istanbul. I think a lot has been said about them already. The challenge for them will be obvious going forward. Secondly, I would actually put the MHP, the nationalist movement party, because most of the rhetoric that President Erdogan used in the campaign actually ended up in adding to the vote count of the MHP rather than his own, and so he actually weakened the AK party a bit in the campaign with the rhetoric that he used. And then thirdly, of course, the People's Democratic Party, the HDP, because by deciding not to put up candidates in some elections, they helped the alliance, even though they weren't actually members. And so they did that, and they held on to their their traditional strongholds in the southeast, Diyarbakir and so on. But in a way, Mr. Erdogan, by taking a majority of votes in his alliance, still demonstrated his strength across the country and gave him plenty of ammunition in the months and years ahead.
Sinan, you touched on this earlier, but given that AKP has run some of these big cities for nearly 2.5 decades now, the transfer of power is a pretty big deal. How is that process playing out in Istanbul and Ankara?
The big question here is about Istanbul. The transfer of power has happened in Ankara and in other cities that AK Party had lost to CHP, particularly the big metropolitan cities on the Mediterranean coast like Antalya, which is the touristic capital of Turkey, but also Adana, Mersin, and even the border town of Hatay. But the big question remains Istanbul, where there has been a series of challenges. And the High Electoral Board is now being asked to adjudicate and decide whether these challenges will lead to a recount of the vote. In some places it has had. But now the only remaining challenge, which is for AK Party, is a request to essentially annul the elections and have a new round of elections on the 2nd of June. On grounds of, voter fraud. So that's what the High Electoral Board now needs to decide. The question, of course, with regard to the functioning of the Electoral Board is that, at least from the standpoint of the opposition, the decisions of the High Electoral Board has been vastly inconsistent. In some cases where the opposition had asked for a recount, they refused. In most cases where the ruling party asked for a recount, they accepted. And this is really about concerns that the board itself is not independent and is under a political pressure. So we still have a few days before we know the final decision of the board and whether the elections in Istanbul will be reheld or not.
Bob, taking a step back, how has Erdogan responded to the electoral loss? And what does this say about what the AKP will do going forward?
Actually, I think there might be an analogy here to the way the AKP reacted to the June 2015 elections, which they lost. Then, too, Mr. Erdogan took a big tent, embracing approach, giving the opposition an opportunity to see if they could form a government, and so on. And he waited until the moment came when he could say that they were not able to do that, and then he began to campaign on the grounds of their incompetence and their failure to lead the country and so on. And so, in a way, I see him taking that big tent, moderate approach now, while the party itself is hard at work trying to challenge elections in Istanbul and elsewhere. So, given enough time, as there will be certainly inabilities to do things in the cities and so on, he might capitalize on that. I was told, but I can't say for sure, that he has the authority to cap a city's budget at a certain number, and everything above that number will be subject to national control. So I don't know how that's been deployed yet, but I understand it's out there, and if so, it gives him a powerful tool to manage the process. So he has his parliamentary majority. I see pretty much a replay of what happened after the June 2015 elections.
It's worth noting that the municipal budget for Istanbul is actually much bigger than a number of the national ministry budgets. I think it's around $8 billion a year. It is a significant pot of money from which to play with.
I might just quickly add, too, that there was a series of violent events after the June 2015 election. Now we've seen one. Again, Mr. Erdogan has condemned it, yet it happened. And so I will be looking to see if there might be other violent events that take place here that indicate unrest and instability in the country.
How concerned on that point are you about the risk of potential political polarization, future violence in light of the attack on CHP head Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu?
I think it has to exist. It means that it is possible. It means that moving around freely in the electorate at events and so on now is more risky. It means that the security for those events is still largely supplied by the state. And so it does exist, and it has a kind of intimidation result. So I think we'll just have to watch this carefully and see if Mr. Erdogan's actions really support the words that he has said about condemning this violence.
Sinan, I'd like to get your thoughts on this point.
It is indeed sad to see the event where the head of the Turkish opposition was attacked. and the Turkish courts ruled to conditionally free the culprit of this attack. And this decision was heavily criticized by the opposition. So this indeed points to a degree of polarization in the country that is not particularly conducive to allowing the political leadership on both sides to essentially soften the current political climate, because that was essentially the hope. In the past few years, really since 2015, Turkey went through a very heavy electoral calendar with presidential elections, national elections, and a referendum thrown in. And the hope was that after these local elections held in March 2019, theoretically, there won't be any elections until 2023, so the country can go back to a mode of governance and political leadership that would allow it to tackle its more core problems. But so far, we have not seen political tension being softened. On the contrary, it remains at an alarmingly high level. And therefore, until the electoral board decides about the fate of the elections in Istanbul, I suppose this will be the political environment that we shall witness.
Thanks. Shifting gears from domestic politics to international affairs, I suppose it's something of an understatement to say that Turkey and the U.S. are going through a rough patch at the moment. One of the major points of contention, and there are, of course, a number, is a dispute over the Russian S-400 missile defense system. This issue's been around for a while, but it's really coming to a head now, and both sides seem quite entrenched into their respective positions. Bob, what's the latest on that, and how do you see things playing out from here?
Well, I think there is a group at the State Department led by Ambassador Jim Jeffrey that is working hard to try to find some compromise space from which one could move to settle other issues. On the S-400 question, I think that Mr. Erdogan's March 7 talk irrevocably confirming the S-400 deal is what triggered this new crisis. The Defense Department, as you know, immediately decided that they would now not ship parts or provide services with respect to the F-35 and gave the clearest notice yet that the F-35 fighter could not be delivered if the S-400 system was put into place and made operational. And then the Congress pointed out that the purchase of Soviet equipment is actually a violation of American sanctions laws, and those are automatic. And so this presents another aspect to the problem. If it were possible that Turkey could decide to slow down the installation of the system, could even make it only partially operational for an extended period of time of study, research, et cetera, then that might open up a space in which the U.S. and Turkey could talk, and the Americans might be able to make an offer on the Patriot missile system that the Turks would be willing to listen to. 15 other countries have the Patriot system. Most of them are American allies in NATO, so there's no particular reason why Turkey could not take up this offer if it wished to.
Sinan, what's at stake for Turkey, and how much of this is a technical issue about the Patriot versus the S-400 versus the kind of broader question of Turkish room for kind of geostrategic or diplomatic flexibility?
It's a combination of, the technical requirement and a political dispute. Now, Turkey has a very clear need to enhance its ballistic missile defense system and its air defense. The original idea when this process started was to purchase a system that would help Turkey alleviate its strategic vulnerability on ballistic missile defense. Turkey is in a neighborhood where we have witnessed a proliferation of weapons of mass destruction with countries that have their own ballistic missile programs like Iran and Syria. So Turkey wanted to enhance its own capability to defend against this threat. Eventually, however, when Ankara opted for the S-400, the Turkish authorities realized that the S-400 could not be made operational by having it linked to the NATO infrastructure, which would be required if Turkey wanted to have an effective missile defense system, because Turkey cannot replicate the type of signal information that the NATO system provides, ranging from satellites up in space, AWACS airplanes, and the X-band radars, and so on. So therefore, the thinking has shifted in Ankara that this system can therefore be used as a standalone system to complement Turkey's air defenses. Turkey traditionally used its air force to do air defense, but after the coup and the number of pilots had been purged from the air force, so therefore with a ground-to-air system like the S-400, Turkey could therefore complement its air force in its task of protecting Turkey's airspace. So that's the requirement on the Turkish side. But obviously, it is becoming very clear that this is not just a technical issue, that acquiring the S-400 for whatever role that it will be tasked for, in this case exclusively for air defense, it will lead to an escalation with the United States, basically because it will trigger the CAATSA sanctions in all likelihood and will be considered as a significant transaction under CAATSA. But in addition to that, on grounds of a number of technical concerns, it may also lead to the suspension of the F-35 program for Turkey, so the non-delivery of the F-35 to Turkey, but also the exclusion of the Turkish military industry from the industrial cooperation component of the F-35 program. That's where we are today. And so we really have to think how we got here. So, was this the Turkish government definitely not heeding the words or the criticism of Washington? Or was there any wrong or misperceived messaging from Washington? Some of this messaging was done at the technical level, but not necessarily at the top political level. So whether this was really on Trump's agenda at a time when Turkey could have shifted its position. There's all of these complications. And on top of that, we obviously have to add the Russia factor, where this purchase of strategic weapon system from Russia is viewed by some in Ankara as a way to keep Russia on Turkey's side in Syria, and that support will be needed. And from the Russian perspective, of course, this is a very effective way to start a dispute between Turkey and the US, possibly an escalation that would also have implications for the cohesion of the NATO alliance.
Well, I think that all those are really excellent points. Turkey's Air Force now flies F-16s, some of which are 40 years old. So it needs another 100 fighters, another 100 advanced fighters. If the S-400 system means so much to Turkey that they would give up the advanced fighters, that would be an enormous move on the part of President Erdogan with respect to Turkey's national security. The S-400 system, with neighbors like Syria and Iran, who are allies of Russia, would be very difficult to imagine that system being used against allies of Russia, and it would be unusual for them to be thinking of attacking Turkey at this point in history. One of the problems with the F-35 is that it's a stealth aircraft. People in the Pentagon are quite worried that flying the F-35 against the S-400 in drills would help the Russians identify the signature of the airplane wherever it flew in the world against Russian systems, and therefore give it an advantage. And the S-400 system was designed specifically to counter the F-35. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that 2 weeks ago, the Russians deployed a new S-400 regiment, that's the term they use, into Kaliningrad. So in Brussels at the NATO Council, Turkey will be explaining how to defend NATO's northern tier against the S-400 in Kaliningrad, and explaining why the S-400 against the southern tier of NATO is no threat. So it puts them in a pretty contradictory position. I hope that they have enough flexibility to help the U.S. find a way out. I think the U.S. could have gone to them with better terms on the Patriot earlier, but where we are today, and I think it would be good to try to move back toward that middle.
So now the other factor that complicates this too is the fact that Turkey is a supplier and contributor to the F-35 program. I believe they supply something in the high single-digit percentage of the parts, meaning that if the F-35 is off the table, that would also call into question the revenues for those companies at a time when Turkey's, of course, trying to build up its defense industry as well. How much of an issue is that? Is that something that's factoring into the decision-making?
Personally, I certainly hope that it would, because obviously that's a non-insignificant benefit for the Turkish military industry. Not only the portfolio itself, it's about $12 billion, but also being part of this, multinational effort that would enable the Turkish military industry to transfer some technology or at least to improve its technological edge. So that's also in itself an important objective. So when you really look at the pros and cons of this potential purchase, it is difficult to see how the purchase of the S-400 would end up serving Turkey's interest. But we're sort of stuck in this bad equilibrium, and therefore we're trying to figure out what can possibly be the way forward, both for Washington and Ankara, to create some political space that would allow them to reach an understanding so as not to end up in the scenario of escalation, which would be a lose-lose for both sides, more so for Turkey, but also for the US, because it would have implications for the bilateral relationship. It would also have implications for the functioning of NATO itself, or at least the cohesion of NATO itself.
I might also add that on the American side, one of the complications is that if Turkey didn't produce these parts, then other partners' shares of production, cost, technology, and so on would have to be readjusted. That would require a good deal of negotiation. So that's a factor that the Americans may have in mind and perhaps should have in mind.
And presumably take time to rejig the supply lines and all that sort of stuff too. The final issue that I wanted to touch on today was this week's announcement by the U.S. government about sanctions waivers on imports of Iranian oil. Obviously, Turkey is a major importer of Iranian energy, both oil and gas. Sinan, what does this mean for Turkey? Who's it going to buy from? How quickly could it switch over if it needs to? And how disruptive is this?
Iran is a neighboring country to Turkey, so Turkey gets oil from Iran at relatively cheaper rates. And now Turkey was also part of the list of countries that succeeded in getting a waiver from the US when these sanctions were imposed last year after the US withdrawal from the JCPOA. And there was an expectation in Ankara that this waiver would be extended, given that Turkey was cutting down on its oil imports from Iran. Now, of course, the situation is that, almost suddenly, Turkey finds itself in a situation where it is being expected to end its imports from Iran. And the alternatives that have been on the table, at least that's what we keep hearing from Washington, is that Turkey could seek to obtain more from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But the political relationship with both Saudi Arabia and UAE at the moment is pretty bad, so Turkey does not want to rely on those countries specifically. It could obtain a supply of oil from international markets, surely, but it would come at a higher price at a time when Turkey's economy is already under stress, and it would certainly increase the import bill as well. So those are all unwanted consequences for Turkey, and this sudden termination of the waiver is yet another potential or actual dispute that piles on a set of unresolved ones with the US that has created an unprecedented relationship for the Turkey-US ties, as Ambassador Pearson, I'm sure, will evaluate, since perhaps the embargo after the Cyprus intervention in 1974. That's really bad.
I think those are very good points. Oil is fungible, of course. It is possible to buy it on the world market. It would be more expensive. I think from the American standpoint, the three countries that would be most affected by the sanctions on Iranian oil would be China, India, and Turkey. China is more likely than the other two to devise ways around this partially. India, perhaps. Turkey is likely to be the most directly affected. But the object of the American administration's decision is to further punish Iran for its behavior, its active ballistic missile system, which is endangering all the Middle East and may be one unstated reason for an S-400 system. And the passage of Iran through southern Syria into Lebanon and the increased threat to Israel. So it is behavior that needs to be countered, in my personal opinion. And I do know that it will hurt Turkey. I hope that the Iranian regime will have a reaction to this that makes it possible for those sanctions to be lifted in due course. But for the moment, the importance of punishing Iran is greater than the importance of helping Turkey.
We should probably wrap things up, but any final thoughts, Sinan?
I just want to repeat the last part of my previous contribution, which is that unfortunately we are heading towards a major escalation between Turkey and the US, not only because of the S-400, but because of the fact that we now have accumulation of disputes that remain unresolved. And, the Iran waivers is one of them, but also US support to the YPG in Syria is certainly a big issue in Turkey and a major concern. The unresolved case of Halkbank and a potential fine, the S-400 itself. And it's difficult to see, unfortunately, whether the leadership, both in Ankara and in Washington at the highest level, will have the bandwidth and the maturity to be able to tackle these large problems. Let's hope so.
Bob, where do you see things going from here?
I was intrigued by a report today that Mr. Erdogan said at a rally that he had been in touch with Mr. Trump and that they might meet soon. I don't know whether that's good news or not good news, but it indicates it means that from Mr. Erdogan's point of view, he is trying to create a space in which conversations should take place. So if that is true, and this has now been a kind of theme for the last 2 weeks or so, then maybe the two countries are trying to see if there isn't something there that would provide common ground for them to move forward. I certainly hope so.
Myself as well. We'll have to wait and see what happens. I'm afraid we'll have to leave things there for today, but thank you to Bob and Sinan for joining the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.